One of the difficulties we have as Christians is taking the stories that we read in the Bible and understanding them today, because the most recent stories in the Bible took place 2,000 years ago. So Christians have always used a variety of ways to help us to understand and focus on the lessons of God's Word. One way Christians have remained focused on the Easter story is through what we sometimes call the Stations of the Cross. These stations are usually pictures, sometimes in stained glass, depicting various stops Jesus took on his way to the cross. We want to do something different with these stations. Here we are presenting some of those stops, but rather than just look, we want you to experience the story in a way you never have before. So as we guide you through these stations, take the time to think about what really happened, remembering that these stories are true, that the characters were real people, and that the consequences of what happened on that day 2,000 years ago have affected all of history. None of it was an accident. God planned it from the beginning. And the whole of the Bible, every word, is ultimately about Jesus and what he did on that day. In the book of Exodus, we read about Moses leading the Hebrew people out of bondage in Egypt and into the Promised Land. We've all seen Charlton Heston as Moses confronting Yul Brynner's Pharaoh, saying, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says no over and over again, despite plague after plague sent by God, until at last God sends an angel of death to take the firstborn of every house in Egypt, except for the houses marked by the blood of a sacrificed lamb. For centuries after, the people of Israel remembered that moment by celebrating Passover. They continue this practice even today with the traditional Seder meal. This is a very specific meal, with each item on the plate representing something significant. There's a vegetable that represents hope and redemption, and is dipped in salt water or vinegar to represent the tears shed by Israel. There's a bitter herb, usually horseradish, that symbolizes slavery. There's a mixture of fruit, nuts, and seasonings representing the mortar used by the Jewish people during their slavery. A roasted egg represents life, and a piece of roasted lamb shank symbolizes the sacrifice made to a God that is delivering his people. Alongside all of this, there's a stack of 3 pieces of unleavened bread along with a glass of wine. As Passover approached, Jesus had his disciples prepare a special Passover meal in a borrowed upper room. For the disciples, this meal was one they were very familiar with. They thought they knew what to expect. But Jesus knew that this Passover was going to be unlike any other. While most of the disciples were preparing for Passover, one of their number had different plans. Judas is a complicated character for us. He was untrustworthy, greedy, and obviously very calculating. He was also personally chosen by Jesus himself to be a disciple, and that choice was no mistake. Jesus knew what he was getting with Judas. But we don't know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Maybe he was sick of following Jesus around. Maybe he thought that after years of serving, he deserved more. Maybe he thought he was forcing Jesus' hand and propelling him towards a role as leader of Israel and head of the rebellion against the Romans. Whatever Judas' motivation was, we know his price: 30 pieces of silver. That's what it would take for him to betray his best friend, to hand him over to known enemies that wanted to kill him. We can look down on Judas and judge him for his betrayal, but we also need to take the time to reflect on the fact that we too are betrayers. Every sin we commit, every time we do something apart from what God has commanded and what God wants for us, we are betraying the love of God. We are rebelling against a good and kind king. Judas's price for betrayal was around $500. What's your price? After Jesus was betrayed, he was handed over to the Jewish ruling council for a trial. Since the whole situation was set up, the ending was a foregone conclusion. The whole of the trial was a farce. Witnesses were brought in to lie. It was done under the cover of night, which was illegal, and the ultimate sentence of death couldn't be carried out by the Jewish leaders. That's why Pilate was brought into the picture. He was the Roman-appointed ruler of the region, and Jesus was brought to him for sentencing. After questioning him, and even trying to pass him off on Herod, another Roman official, Jesus ends up standing in his fourth trial of that night, and Pilate declares him innocent. However, the mob that the Jewish leaders had worked up outside Pilate's palace wouldn't accept that ruling. They wanted blood, and they let Pilate know. So Pilate tries a little trick. He gives the crowd the choice of a prisoner to be released, the peaceful preacher Jesus, or a violent man in prison for treason and murder, Barabbas. To Pilate's surprise, the people wanted the murderer rather than the preacher. Pilate has a choice. Do what's right or do what's easy and safe. He chose the easy route, saying, I am innocent of his blood, and washing his hands to symbolize his innocence. But no matter how much he washes, no amount of water and soap could cleanse Pilate of all that guilt. That's how sin works. It sticks to us. We can't get rid of it. Nothing we can do will get it off. Our sin marks us, and it marks us for death. For the Romans, it wasn't good enough just to kill someone. They made a spectacle of it, and it was brutal. They spent decades perfecting how to kill as savagely as possible. And it has been said that crucifixion is the most terrible form of death humans have ever conceived of. It started not with the cross, but with torture, mocking and a savage beating. The victim was chained to a post, bent over, and whipped with a multi-stranded leather whip that would have had metal, glass, and bone bits embedded into it. The result of the beating would occasionally kill the victim as, with each stroke, skin and muscle and occasionally a rib would be torn off of the body. The blood loss would have been immense. And all of it was done publicly, with the insults being shouted by soldiers and audience alike. To add to the misery, the soldiers wove together a crown made out of long, sharp thorns that they jammed onto Jesus' head. And a cloth cloak was thrown over his back while they taunted this beaten, bloody, quote, King of the Jews. Then before they would march Jesus away, and after there had been time for the blood to seep into the cloth and begin to dry, they ripped it off of him. All this was done to an innocent man. Jesus didn't fight back or argue. He accepted the punishment for us. The hill that the Romans used as an execution site was aptly named the place of the skull. Romans picked these sites carefully. It was high up and next to a major road so that the maximum number of people would see what happens when you oppose the Roman government. Jesus made his way there, step after agonizing step. And the crossbeam was laid and attached to the vertical piling while it was laid flat on the ground. Then Jesus was lashed to the cross, before the soldiers drove 3 5 to 7 inch iron nails through his wrists and his ankles and into the wood behind them. The soldiers would then lift the cross with Jesus on it up until it dropped into the post hole that had been dug to keep it upright. The final violent drop of several feet into the hole likely would have dislocated most of the joints in Jesus' body. There Jesus hung, exposed to the heat and wind, surrounded by a crowd that included a mixture of sadistic spectators and mourning loved ones. There were a couple of ways Jesus could have died. Blood loss was very possible, considering the beatings he had taken. The most common form of death was asphyxiation. In order to take a breath, the crucified people would have had to push up on the nails in their ankles while pulling on the nails in their wrists in order to lift their chest up and inhale. Eventually there would come a moment when they could no longer do so, either from exhaustion or from the Romans moving things along by breaking their legs. But Jesus didn't die that way. No, Jesus' heart exploded, a condition referred to today as cardiac rupture. This is evidenced by the report that the soldiers pierced his side and blood and fluid came out. Some have said that this shows that Jesus died of a broken heart, which really is very appropriate given the situation. Jesus was there hanging on a wooden cross that came from a tree that he, as creator of all things, had caused to grow. He was held up by nails made of iron that he had placed in the ground, and he was being tortured, mocked, and killed by human beings that he had not only lovingly and painstakingly created, but whose lives he was presently continuing. There was the eternal Word, the God of creation, who made himself flesh. He was never under anyone's control but his own. Nothing happened that he did not allow to happen. The only thing that kept Jesus hanging on that cross was his love for us.
As you would expect, the Son of God did not die quietly. Jesus cried out one last time and gave up his spirit. At that moment, the earth shook and the rocks were split. Graves that had been sealed were suddenly opened and their formerly dead occupants came back to life. In the midst of all that chaos, the great curtain in the temple, a 4-inch thick piece of cloth separating the Holy of Holies, the throne room of God, from the world of humanity, was torn in two from top to bottom. That barrier that separated God and man was gone. From that moment forward, humanity would have access to its Creator thanks to the execution of the only truly innocent man to ever live. At that dramatic moment, one of the Roman soldiers standing guard at the foot of Jesus' cross finally understood what was happening and proclaimed, "Truly, this was the Son of God."
The day after the dramatic death of Jesus was the Sabbath, and Jesus' body remained at rest on that day. But the following day was something very different. 2 of Jesus' closest friends began that morning preparing perfumes and spices and supplies to dress Jesus' body for its final permanent rest. Or so they thought. As they approached the tomb where Jesus' body had been laid, they found nothing, no body. The tomb was empty. It's like showing up to a funeral and finding out the casket is empty, and the body of your loved one just disappeared. You would assume, as they did, that someone took it. But an angel was there to tell them the good news. There is nothing in all of creation that can hold the Creator. There's no tomb, no cave, no coffin, no box that can trap the King of the universe. Jesus, the Son of God, the Word that became flesh and lived with us, had risen from the dead. In this story, we're confronted with Jesus, a man who claimed to be God, who performed miracles, who taught difficult things, and we must respond. C.S. Lewis famously laid out a formulation of how we can respond to Jesus. There are 3 possibilities. We could see Jesus as a liar. He knew what he was claiming when he said that he was God's son and that he would take away the sins of the world and that we needed to follow him. And he knew those things were not true. If he's a liar, we have to reject him in the strongest way possible. The second possible response is that he's a lunatic, as Lewis said, on the level of a man who claims to be a poached egg. In this case, Jesus really believed those things that he said, but they're clearly not true. If that's the case, then we can just ignore Jesus. But the problem is, Jesus backed up his claims. They can't be proven false, and history has shown that there is something incredible about this Jesus, which leads us to the final possible response. That what Jesus said is true, that he is God in skin, that he is Lord, that we must give him ourselves simply because he is owed everything. He has created us, and when we walked away from him, he made a way for us to be forgiven and restored to a relationship with our Creator. At the beginning, we talked about that Passover meal. At the end of that special meal, Jesus did something unexpected and extraordinary. He stopped for a moment. He picked up a piece of that unleavened bread, and he said, "This is my body, broken for you." And he took a cup of wine and he said, "This is my blood poured out for you, a new covenant, a new promise for you." In this, Jesus is giving us a promise. If we trust him, if we follow him, we will receive everything: forgiveness, heaven, eternal peace, and hope, and love. And all we have to do is receive it and follow him. So we have to pick our response. There's no opting out. We can reject him. We can ignore him, or we can embrace him and his promise. You have a choice now. If you want, you can be done with this experience and walk out the door. Or, if you choose, we have one more stop for you. You can embrace this promise. Take Jesus as Lord, maybe for the first time, or maybe you're simply reaffirming a decision you've already made, and you can receive the body and the blood of Christ as symbols of the sacrifice that Jesus has made for us and the promise that Jesus has made to us.